History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 1 Long Term Change. This suggests, rightly, that generalizations about the pace and uniformity of what was happening should be cautious and qualified. For all the enthusiasm Germans were showing for traveling exhibitions of agricultural machinery in the 1840s, theirs was a huge country, and one of those, France was the other, of which a great economic historian commented that, broadly speaking, no general and thoroughgoing improvement can be registered in peasant life before the railway age. Yet, the dismantling of medieval institutions standing in the way of agricultural improvement did go on steadily before that and prepared the way for it. It was accelerated in some places by the arrival during the Napoleonic period of French armies of occupation, which introduced French law, and after this, by other forces, so that by 1850 peasants tied to the soil and obligatory labor had disappeared from most of Europe. This did not mean, of course, that attitudes from the Ancien regime did not linger after its institutions had disappeared. Prussian, Magyar, and Polish landlords seem, for good and ill, to have maintained much of their more or less patriarchal authority in the manor, even after its legal supports had vanished, and did so as late as 1914. This was important in assuring a continuity of conservative aristocratic values in a much more intense and concentrated way in these areas than in Western Europe. The Junker often accepted the implications of the market in planning his own estate management, but not in his relations with his tenants. The longest resistance to change in traditional legal forms in agriculture came in Russia. There, serfdom itself persisted until abolished in 1861. This act did not at once bring Russian agriculture entirely under the operation of individualist and market economy principles, but with it, an era of European history had closed. From the Urals to Coruna, there no longer survived in law any substantial working of land on the basis of serfdom, nor were peasants any longer bound to landlords whom they could not leave. It was the end of a system which had been passed from antiquity to Western Christendom in the era of the barbarian invasions and had been the basis of European civilization for centuries. After 1861, Europe's rural proletariat everywhere worked for wages or keep. The pattern which had begun to spread in England and France with the 14th century agricultural crisis had become universal. Formally, the medieval usage of bond labor lasted longest in some of the American countries forming part of the European world. Obligatory labor in its most unqualified form, slavery, was legal in some of the United States until the end of the Great Civil War in 1865, when its abolition, though promulgated by the victorious government 2 years before, became effective throughout the whole republic. The war which had made this possible had been in some measure a distraction from the already rapid development of the country, now to be resumed and to become of vital significance to Europe. Even before the war, cotton growing, the very agricultural operation which had been the center of debates over slavery, had already shown how the New World might supplement European agriculture on such a scale as to become almost indispensable. After the war, the way was open for the supply to Europe not merely of products such as cotton, which she could not easily grow, but also of food. The United States and Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the Argentine and Uruguay were soon to show they could offer food at much cheaper prices than Europe herself. Two things made this possible. One was the immense extent of these new lands now added to Europe's own resources. The American plains, the huge stretches of pasture in the South American pampas and the temperate regions of Australasia provided vast areas for growing of grain and raising of livestock. The second was a revolution in transport which made them exploitable for the first time. Steam driven railways and ships came into service in increasing numbers from the 1860s. These quickly brought down transport costs and did so all the faster as lower prices bred growing demand. Thus, further profits were generated to be put into more capital investments on the ranges and prairies of the New World. On a smaller scale, the same phenomenon was at work inside Europe too. From the 1870s, the Eastern European and German farmers began to see that they had a competitor in Russian grain, able to reach the growing cities much more cheaply once railways were built in Poland and Western Russia, and steamships could bring it from Black Sea ports. By 1900, the context in which European farmers worked, whether they knew it or not, was the whole world. The price of Chilean guano or New Zealand lamb could already settle what went on in their local markets. Even in such a sketch, the story of agricultural expansion burst its banks after first creating civilization and then setting a limit to its advance for thousands of years. Agriculture suddenly became its propellant. Within a century or so, it suddenly demonstrated that it could feed many more people than ever before. The demand of the growing cities, the coming of the railways, the availability of capital all point to its inseparable interconnection with other sides of the growing transoceanic economy between 1750 and 1870. For all its chronological primacy and its huge importance as a generator of investment capital, the story of agriculture in this period should only, for convenience, be separated from that of overall growth registered in the most obvious and spectacular way by the appearance of a whole new society, one based on large scale industrialization. This is another colossal subject. It is not even easy to see just how big it is. It produced the most striking change in European history since the barbarian invasions, but it has been seen as even more important, as the biggest change in human history since the coming of agriculture, iron, or the wheel. Within a fairly short time, a century and a half or so, societies of peasants and craftsmen turned into societies of machine tenders and bookkeepers. Ironically, it ended the ancient primacy of agriculture from which it had sprung. It was one of the major facts turning human experience back from the differentiation produced by millennia of cultural evolution to common experiences, which would tend once more towards cultural convergence. Even to define it is by no means easy, although the processes which lie at its heart are obvious around us. One is the replacement of human or animal labor by machines driven by power from other, increasingly mineral sources. Another is organization of production in much larger units. Another is increasing specialization of manufacturing. But all these things have implications and ramifications which quickly take us far beyond them. Although it embodied countless conscious decisions by countless entrepreneurs and customers, industrialization also looks like a blind force sweeping across social life with transforming power, one of the senseless agencies. A philosopher once detected as half the story of revolutionary change. Industrialization implied new sorts of towns, needed new schools and new forms of higher learning, and very quickly, new patterns of daily existence and living together. The roots which made such a change possible go back far beyond the early modern age. Capital for investment had been accumulated slowly over many centuries of agricultural and commercial innovation. Knowledge had been built up too. Canals were to provide the first network of communications for bulk transport once industrialization got underway, and from the 18th century they began to be built as never before in Europe. In China, of course, the story was different. Yet, even Charlemagne's men had known how to build them. Even the most startling technical innovations had roots deep in the past. The men of the Industrial Revolution, as the Frenchmen of the early 19th century named the great upheaval of this era, stood on the shoulders of innumerable craftsmen and artificers of pre industrial times who had slowly built up skills and experience for the future. 14th century Rhinelanders, for example, learned to make cast irons. By 1600, the gradual spread of blast furnaces had begun to remove the limits hitherto set to the use of iron by its high cost, and in the 18th century came the inventions making it possible to use coal instead of wood as fuel for some processes. Cheap iron, even in what were by later standards small quantities, led to experiment with new ways of using it. Further changes would then follow. New demand meant that areas where ore was easily to be found became important. When new techniques of smelting permitted the use of mineral rather than vegetable fuel, the location of supplies of coal and iron began to fashion the later industrial geography of Europe and North America. In the northern hemisphere lies much of the discovered coal supply of the world, in a great belt running from the basin of the Don through Silesia, the Ruhr, Lorraine, the north of England and Wales, to Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Better metal and richer fuel made their decisive contribution to early industrialization with the invention of a new source of energy, the steam engine. Again, the roots are very deep. That the power of steam could be used to produce movement was known in Hellenistic Alexandria. Even if, as some believe, there existed the technology to develop some knowledge, contemporary economic life did not make it worthwhile to strain to do so. The 18th century brought a series of refinements to the technology so important that they can be considered as fundamental changes, and did so when there was money to invest in them. The result was a source of power rapidly recognized as of revolutionary importance. The new steam engines were not only the product of coal and iron, they also consumed them directly, both as fuel and as materials used in their own construction. Indirectly, they stimulated production by making possible other processes which led to increased demand for them. The most obvious and spectacular was railway building. It required huge quantities of first iron and then steel for rails and rolling stock, but it also made possible the movement of goods at much lower costs. What the new trains moved might well again be coal or ore, thus allowing these materials to be used cheaply far from where they were easily found and dug. New industrial areas grew up near to the lines, and the railway could carry away goods from them to distant markets. The railway was not the only change steam made to the transport and communications. The first steamship went to sea in 1809. By 1870, though there were still many sailing ships, and navies were still building battleships with a full spread of sail, regular ocean sailings by steamers were commonplace. The economic effect was dramatic. Oceanic transport's real cost in 1900 was a seventh of what it had been 100 years earlier. The shrinking of costs, of time spent in transit, and of space, which steam engines and railways produced, overturned conventional ideas of the possible. Since the domestication of the horse and the invention of the wheel, people and goods have been conveyed at speeds which certainly varied according to the local roads available, but probably only within limits of no more than 1 and 5 miles per hour over any considerable distance. Faster travel was possible on water, and this had perhaps increased somewhat over the millennia in which ships underwent quite considerable modifications. But all such slow improvement was dwarfed when, in a man's lifetime, he could witness the difference between travel on horseback and in a train capable of 40 or even 50 miles an hour for long periods. We have now lost one of the most pleasant of industrial sights. The long steaming plume of steam from the funnel of a locomotive at speed hanging for a few seconds behind it against a green landscape before disappearing. It greatly struck those who first saw it, and so less agreeably did other visual aspects of the industrial transformation. One of the most terrifying was the black industrial town, dominated by a factory with smoking chimneys, as the pre industrial town had been by the spire of church or cathedral. So dramatic and novel was the factory, indeed, that it has often gone unremarked that it was an unusual expression of the early stages of industrialization, not a typical one. Even in the middle of the 19th century, most English industrial workers worked in manufacturing enterprises employing fewer than 50. For a long time, great agglomerations of labor were to be found only in textiles. The huge Lancashire cotton mills, which first gave that area a visual and urban character distinct from earlier manufacturing towns, were startling because they were unique. Yet, by 1850, it was apparent that in more and more manufacturing processes, the trend was towards the centralization under one roof, made attractive by economies of transport, specialization of function, the use of more powerful machinery, and the imposition of effective work discipline. In the middle of the 19th century, the changes of which these were the most striking had only created a mature industrial society in one country, Great Britain. Long and unconscious preparations lay behind this. Domestic peace and less rapacious government than on the continent had bred confidence for investment. Agriculture had provided its new surpluses first in England. Mineral supplies were easily available to exploit the new technological apparatus resulting from 2 or 3 generations of remarkable invention. An expanding overseas commerce generated further profits for investment, and the basic machinery of finance and banking was already in being before industrialization needed to call on it. Society seemed to have readied itself psychologically for change. Observers detected an exceptional sensitivity to pecuniary and commercial opportunity in 18th century England. Finally, an increasing population was beginning to offer both labor and a rising demand for manufactured goods. All these forces flowed together, and the result was unprecedented and continuing industrial growth, first apparent as something totally new and irreversible in the second quarter of the 19th century. By 1870, Germany, France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the United States had joined Great Britain in showing the capacity for self sustained economic growth, but she was still first among them, both in the scale of her industrial plant and in her historic primacy. The inhabitants of the workshop of the world, as the British liked to think of themselves, were fond of running over the figures which showed how wealth and power had followed upon industrialization. In 1850, the United Kingdom owned half the world's ocean going ships and contained half of the world's railway track. On those railways, trains ran with the precision and regularity and even a speed not much improved upon for 100 years after. They were regulated by timetables which were the first examples of their kind, and occasioned the first use of the word, and their operation relied on the electric telegraph. They were ridden in by men and women who had a few years before only ridden in stagecoaches or carter's wagon. In 1851, a year when a great international exhibition at London advertised her new supremacy, Great Britain smelted 2.5 million tons of iron. It does not sound much, but it was 5 times as much as the United States of America and 10 times as much as Germany. At that moment, British steam engines could produce more than 1.2 million horsepower, more than half that of all Europe together. By 1870, a change had already started to appear in relative positions. Great Britain was still, in most ways, in the lead, but less decisively, and was not long to remain there. She still had more steam horsepower than any other European country, but the United States, which had already had more in 1850, was ahead of her, and Germany was coming up fast. In the 1850s, both Germany and France had made the important transition already made in Great Britain from smelting most of their iron by charcoal to smelting with mineral fuels. British superiority in manufacturing iron was still there, and her pig iron output had gone on rising. But now it was only 3.5 times that of the United States and 4 times that of Germany. These were still huge superiorities nonetheless, and the age of British industrial dominance had not yet closed. The industrial countries, of which Great Britain was the first, were puny creatures in comparison with what they were to become. Among them, only Great Britain and Belgium had a large majority of their populations living in urban districts in the middle of the 19th century. The census of 1851 showed that agriculture was still the biggest single employer of labor among the British industries, rivaled only by domestic service. But in these countries, the growing numbers engaged in manufacturing industries, the rise of new concentrations of economic wealth, and a new scale of urbanization all made very visible the process of change which was going forward. Change came to the life of whole regions as workers poured into them. Mills were built and chimneys shot up, transforming even the physical appearance of such places as the West Riding of Yorkshire, the Ruhr, and Silesia as new towns multiplied. They grew at a spectacular rate in the 19th century, particularly in its second half, when the appearance of big centers that would be the nuclei of what a later age would call conurbations was specially marked. For the first time, some European cities ceased to depend on rural immigration for their growth. There are difficulties in reckoning indices of urbanization, largely because in different countries urban areas were defined in different ways. But this does not obscure the main lines of what was happening. In 1800, London, Paris, and Berlin had respectively about 900,000, 600,000, and 170,000 inhabitants. In 1900, the corresponding figures were about 4.7 million, 3.6 million, and 2.7 million. In that year, too, Glasgow, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Vienna also had more than a million inhabitants each. These were the giants. Just behind them were 16 more European cities with over 500,000, a figure only surpassed by London and Paris in 1800. These great cities and smaller ones, which were still immeasurably bigger than the old ones they overshadowed, were still attracting immigrants in large numbers from the countryside, notably in Great Britain and Germany. This reflected the tendency of urbanization to be marked in the relatively few countries where industrialization first made headway, because it was the wealth and employment generated by industry which, to begin with, drew workers to them. Of the 23 cities of more than half a million inhabitants in 1900, 13 were in four countries: the United Kingdom, 6, Germany, 3, France, 3, and Belgium, 1. Opinions about cities has undergone many changes. As the 18th century ended, something like a sentimental discovery of rural life was in full swing. This coincided with the first phase of industrialization, and the 19th century opened with the tide of aesthetic and moral comment on the turn against a city life, which was indeed about to reveal a new and often unpleasant face. That urbanization was seen as an unwelcome, even unhealthy change by many people was a tribute to the revolutionary force of what was going on. Conservatives distrusted and feared cities long after European governments had demonstrated the ease with which they could control urban unrest. The cities were regarded suspiciously as likely nests of revolution. This is hardly surprising. Conditions in many of the new metropolitan centers were often harsh and terrible for the poor. The East End of England could present appalling evidence of poverty, filth, disease, and deprivation to anyone who chose to penetrate its slums. A young German businessman, Friedrich Engels, wrote in 1844 one of the most influential books of the century, The Condition of the English Working Class, to expose the appalling conditions in which lived the poor of Manchester, but many other English writers were drawn to similar themes. In France, the phenomenon of the dangerous classes, as the Parisian poor were called, preoccupied governments for the first half of the century, and misery fired a succession of revolutionary outbreaks between 1789 and 1871. Clearly, it was not unreasonable to fear that the growing cities could breed resentment and hatred of society's rulers and beneficiaries, and that this was a potentially revolutionary force. It was also reasonable to predicate that the city made for ideological subversion. It was the great destroyer of traditional patterns of behavior in the 19th century Europe and a crucible of new social forms and ideas, a huge and anonymous thicket in which men and women easily escaped the scrutiny of priest, squire, and neighbors, which had been the regulator of rural communities. In it, and this was especially true as literacy slowly spread downwards, new ideas were brought to bear upon long unchallenged assumptions. Upper class 19th century Europeans were particularly struck by the seeming tendency of city life to atheism and infidelity, and one of the usual responses was to build more churches. More was at stake, it was felt, than religious truth and sound doctrine about which the upper classes themselves had long comfortably tolerated disagreement. Religion was the great sustainer of morals and the support of the established social order. A revolutionary writer, Karl Marx, sneered that religion was the opium of the people. The possessing classes would hardly have put it in the same terms, but they acknowledged the importance of religion as social cement. One result was a long continued series of attempts in both Catholic and Protestant countries to find a way of recapturing the towns for Christianity. The effort was misconceived insofar as it presumed that the churches had ever had any footing in the urban areas, which had long since swamped the traditional parish structures and religious institutions of the old towns and villages at their hearts. but it had a variety of expressions from the building of a new church in industrial suburbs to the creation of missions combining evangelism and social service, which taught churchmen the facts of modern city life. By the end of the century, the religious minded were at least well aware of the challenge they faced, even if their predecessors had not been. One great English evangelist used in the title of one of his books words precisely calculated to emphasize the parallel with missionary work in pagan lands overseas. Darkest England. His answer was to found a quite new instrument of religious propaganda designed to appeal specifically to a new kind of population and to combat specifically the ills of urban society, the Salvation Army.